Hello everyone, Sandra here. I think sometime in this week, someone was asking about elemental reactions and kind of how they work in depth. So, which is why I thought I would make a video on this. The video is actually based off a guide I wrote a while back in 1.4. I was trying to enter for the 1.4 guide competition on the Hoyo Lab. Of course, I didn't win because this is not a very well-aware topic because I've only seen Chinese side talking about this. I've never seen any English communities talking about this. Even the more mass heavy dudes, they have never talked about this. So which is why I thought I would bring this into light, because these actually are calculated when you deal damage and take damage, which is important for you to know. That these meters do exist in Genshin Impact, and of course, if you're not a really mass heavy guy, just know that these stuff exists, and someday if you want to, you can take advantage of this. But if you don't, building team is still just fine without knowing these stuff. That's why most players are able to just put four characters in a team and build a team just fine. Before we get started, if you like the content, please consider subscribing. Thank you, and let's get started. So I'll just quickly go over elemental reactions first. So what plus what causes what. Then I'll go into in-depth on the different strength level of the reactions you can apply, and then also how each reaction reacts and deals damage. So the first one is, of course, the basic reaction. So anything plus anemo is swirl. Two things to know for that fact. Anemo can, once swirl occurs, it will cause 2 damage. It will cause 2 damage or 3 damage, depending on the number of enemies on the field. If there is no enemy, if there's only one enemy on the field, it will cause the initial anemo damage from that reaction, because the anemo part of the swirl, and it'll cause the swirl damage, which will be the elemental damage of whatever element the anemo is swirling. So anemo plus pyro, you will get 1 anemo damage and 1 pyro damage. However, if you have more than 2 enemies on the field, or exactly 2 enemies on the field, they will spread onto each other. So instead, you'll get 3 damage, which is the initial anemo damage from the swirl, the other elemental damage from the swirl itself, and also on top of that, the elemental damage of that element that is getting swirled. However, this one is being passed on from a nearby enemy onto this one. So if you have 2, they would swirl to each other. They would spread onto each other. If you have more than 2, they would spread onto another enemy. Spread can only occur once, so which is why for anemo characters, there tends to be a lot better facing multiple enemies than a single target fight. Now moving on to Geo. Geo crystallizes with any other element other than anemo currently in the game. And for Geo, the timer is always 15 seconds for the shield when you pick up the crystal. However, the only thing differs with Geo is that it only scales off elemental mastery, and then that decides the HP you'll get from that shield itself. So the shield can be treated as a temporary extra HP bar, which is why with the more elemental mastery you have, the higher the shield. Which is why for support characters, it is a bad idea. However, for like support characters like Albedo, who generates a lot of shield, having a little bit of elemental mastery stacking is not too bad. Whereas for people like Zhongli, you want to strictly avoid elemental mastery because he does not even cause Crystallize to get his shield. So moving on to the normal ones, I'll talk about the transformative reactions first, and then I'll talk about the non-transformative ones. If you don't know, transformative reactions are anything caused by hydro, pyro, cryo, and electro, with the exception of vaporize and melt. And non-transformative reactions are exactly vaporize and melt. For transformative reactions, when the reaction occurs, only the elemental mastery and the character's level is taken into account for the damage of the reaction itself. Of course, the damage from the elements that causes the reaction. So say if you use Kachin's E followed by Amber's Baron Bunny to cause an overload reaction, then the damage for Kachin's E and the damage for Amber's Baron Bunny scales off whatever their skill scales off. However, the reaction damage of that overload scales off only their level and elemental mastery, and the second one is elemental mastery. So it is very important to know that, which is why transformative reaction recently got a buff from elemental mastery. So for transformative reaction, Pyro plus Electro is overload, which causes an explosion. Pyro plus, sorry, Hydro plus Electro is electro charged. It not only causes electro damage, it also spreads the effect onto nearby enemies that have the wet status, that is affected by Hydro. Cryo plus Electro is superconduct. It decreases the physical resistance for enemies by 40%, which is why it's super important that most of the cryo DPS in the game, both Eula and Razor and Xinyan, all need to run a superconduct comp to increase their damage. And on top of that, the meta DPS, the meta physical DPS, Keqing, Razor, and Eula are all ones coming from either Electro or Cryo, because then they only need one extra character to cause superconduct. Now lastly, Cryo and Hydro causes Frozen, and Frozen can, on top of that, if you use a heavy attack from a Claymore user, or if you use a Geo reaction on top of the Frozen, it will cause Shatter, which deals damage, however it breaks the Frozen status, and when characters are under the Frozen status, they cannot move or do anything. Now that is just a brief of. So now let's move on to the non-transformative reactions, Vaporize and Melt. Now these two just do damage. However, these used to be, I believe these are still somewhat the meta comps in the game, because these focus so much on damage that they deal so much damage that you don't care about any other thing. The damage is enough to take out the enemy, so why do you bother want to freeze them or something about it? The damage for when Vaporize occurs, the damage multiplier is a direct multiplier of the damage on that hit. So say if you do 10,000 damage on that hit of the Vaporize, the damage from the Vaporize itself is just a multiple of that 10,000. Now exactly the multiple, I forgot exactly what's the multiple number. However, one thing to make sure is that when you are triggering Vaporize, always trigger from the Pyro side to get more damage. And when you're triggering Melt, always trigger from the Cryo side to get more damage. Because the multipliers are different depending on which element you are triggering it with. So that is a brief overview of the basic elemental reactions. So now let's go into the in-depth elemental reactions. So most of you probably don't know this, and MiHoYo actually counts this in their calculations. However, when an elemental is applied to an enemy, that elemental tag on the enemy has a strength level, and it won't show in game or anything. However, there are 3 different levels of the strength level, and when an enemy is applied, you can't tell the difference between the 3 levels unless you know who applied it. So a weak application will last 9 to 10 seconds without any interruption. A strong application will last 12 to 13 seconds without any interruption, and a super application will last 16 plus seconds without any interruption. Reapplying the same element on the enemy will only refresh the timer. It will not increase the level, so you can never get a strong reaction from applying multiple weak reactions. It will just be the weak reaction with a refresh timer. And also, a stronger application will always override a weaker application, no matter the timer or the element. So if you have a weak electro, then you apply a strong electro. The strong electro will always be the one to be left over, even though the strong electro might have a lower time. So the stronger electro will always be the one that's to be left over after you apply the strong electro. The weak electro will just leave. Now for this one, we're actually going to talk about the non-transformative reactions first, because these are easier to talk about, because it's simpler. They don't account into much more stuff, it's just one hit. So the elemental wise, Hydro counters Pyro. So when Pyro affects the enemy, it loses their So after a Vaporize reaction, a Pyro affected enemy will always lose their Pyro status because Hydro is applied on top of it. And the same case occurs if you apply from the pyro side. So if you have a hydro affected enemy, you apply pyro. The pyro status will not get onto the enemy. The hydro status will stay there because pyro is weaker than hydro when it comes to application. Same case goes. Pyro is stronger than cryo. So after a melt reaction, pyro is always the element to be left over. Now, as for the number of times you can react with, a weak application, say a weak pyro, assuming you are only using melt, so the pyro does not get the pyro does get left over after the reaction, then a weak application can support up to 2 reactions, a strong application can support up to 3 reactions, and a super application can support up to 4 reactions. So the same case goes for pyro, cryo, and hydro between vaporize and melt only. And also note that if you somehow manage to get the wrong order, and the elemental tag will disappear. So say if you apply a strong cryo, which can apply up to 3 times, then you accidentally apply a strong cryo first, followed by the weak pyro, then even though the weak pyro is weak, it is going to override the strong cryo. So what is left over, you would have a weak pyro applied enemy after that, which can only support 1 more reaction because the pyro is weak. Now moving on to the transformative reactions, we'll talk about all the electro reacted first because these are easier. Then we'll move on to freezing, which is more weird. And as for anemo and geo-related reactions, we have already talked about that. There's nothing more to add other than a few little points. So superconduct and electrocharge, for these, after the application, both elements will be left on the enemy, depending on which one's stronger or depending on if anyone's timer got used up. So if assuming all gets left over, then a weak application can support up to 1 time, a strong application can support up to 2 times, and a super application can support up to 3 times. However, one thing to note is that if you use weak and weak, then nothing will be left over because when you applied, that 1 time is already used up, which is most of the case because most of the applications in the game currently are weak applications. However, if you have a strong and a weak, after 1 reaction, the strong will be left having 1 more reaction to go. And if you go with a super and a weak, afterwards the super will be left having 2 more reactions to go. And if you go with a strong and a strong, after 1 reaction, both will be left with 1 more reaction to go for each of them. Moving on to the last one with electro, which is overload. Overload is a weird one. No matter what strength level you use, nothing will be left over because it's causing an explosion. So the elemental tag is kind of removed from the enemy after overload. So for overload, you do need to constantly reapply electron pyro to get the overload thing going. Moving on to freezing. Freezing is a bit more interesting. For freezing, generally speaking, the base frozen time will be 2 seconds, with the exception of strong cryo and strong hydro, which can give you 4 seconds of base frozen time. Why am I saying base frozen time? It's because you also get a bonus time off freezing if you have a positive level difference, so you are at a higher level than the mob, then the timer will increase. How much does it increase by? We're currently not very clear because it's kind of hard to test that. So, however, one thing to note is that you do get a benefit if you are higher level than the enemy when it comes to frozen. Moving on to anemo. Anemo, when the swirl occurs, it only applies weak elements onto nearby enemies. Remember back when I talked about the spread of elemental tags onto nearby enemies, that is only considered a weak application of that element. However, it also has some disadvantages on the original enemy that you applied the element on. So when swirl occurs, the timer on the original target is reduced because you're spreading the timer onto all other ones as well. It also decreases the strength of the original target by 1 level. So say if you have a pyro affected enemy with a strong pyro, after swirl he will only have a weak pyro. And if you have a weak pyro affected enemy, after swirl he would have no pyro. but however, he might get another pyro back from the swirl. That might be the case, but either way, the level will decrease by 1 when swirl occurs. Now for Geo, it is actually the easiest. Crystallize does not take anything into account. It's just a 15 seconds shield. And one thing to note for the shields, this is not reaction wise, but just for the shield wise, when multiple shield is equipped, the one with the longest timer left over overrides the rest, regardless of HP. So say if you theoretically have a 1 HP shield with 15 seconds left, or you have a 1000 HP shield with 14 seconds left, then practically speaking, you have a 1 HP shield with 15 seconds left. Now, moving on to the last part, which is just, I won't talk too much in this part, it's just showing you what every single character in game has in terms of the strength of their applications. So I'll start with Cryo, moving on to Electro, Hydro, and then Pyro, because only these ones the strength level does matter. Now also, this is made back in 1.4, I believe, so Eula and Yanfei is not on this list. So I'll try to find their information and post it in the comments, but do make sure to note that this is a bit outdated, so they are not on this list. So that is all the information I have for you today. If you like the content, please consider subscribing. Thank you and have a nice day.